A steep hike in American tariffs on Chinese goods. How steep? A whopping 100% duty on imports of electric vehicles or EVs. 50% duty on solar cells. 25% duty on steel, aluminium, electric vehicle batteries, and some minerals. So why has the United States imposed heavy tariffs on Chinese imports? Hello and welcome to Connecting the Dots. I'm Munmun Bhattacharya. Let's connect the dots of the second China trade shock, or China Shock 2.0. America is not alone. Canada has imposed a new 100% tariff on imports of electric and other clean vehicles manufactured in China. The European Commission did an investigation on whether electric vehicles made in China were benefiting from illegal subsidization. It has proposed duties on China-made EVs for 5 years. Well, all these countries are trying to protect their industries from an onslaught of cheap Chinese goods flooding their markets because they fear a rerun of the first China trade shock that jolted the world 2001 onwards. This report shows how Western countries are calling out China. The United States is leading the criticism. Its Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen took up the issue during her trip to China in April. Soon, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz echoed the same concerns while on a trip to China. Weeks later, France also hit out at China. G7 was not behind. See their statement issued in Italy expressing concern about China's persistent industrial targeting and comprehensive non-market policies while citing global spillovers, market distortions, and harmful overcapacity in a growing range of sectors. So how is Beijing creating a second trade shock? Well, China's economy is slowing down. It is reeling from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, high unemployment levels, and a real estate debt crisis. It is the only major economy in the world that is dealing with deflation or negative consumer prices. It is importing less than what it used to. China is over-relying on exports to sustain its economic growth. It is subsidizing domestic manufacturers who are producing more than its domestic market can use. So there is excess capacity and this surplus is going overseas. But importing countries are feeling the pinch as the flood of cheaper state-subsidized Chinese goods is adversely impacting their producers. And so countries are looking to slow imports from China to save their domestic industries and livelihoods of their people. Before we go into more details of how other countries are responding to the second China trade shock, let's examine China's strategy closely for its own economic revival and also for global domination of high-tech industries. Chinese President Xi Jinping's administration has its eyes set on the three new industries of solar cells, electric vehicles, and lithium-ion batteries. China is developing its own supply chain ecosystem in these three areas. This is in line with Made in China 2025, China's strategic plan to upgrade manufacturing capabilities of its industries to become a global powerhouse in high-tech industries. Though the rest of the world is also eyeing these three strategic sectors, China is already manufacturing and exporting these goods aggressively. To give you one example, China's manufacturers are pumping out so many solar panels that there is a global glut now and so a price crash. This time, countries are not letting Beijing get its way so easily. So what is the West doing other than imposing steep tariffs on Chinese goods? Before we come to that, let's find out what happened in the first China trade shock that has the world so worried about China Shock 2.0. The term China Shock was coined in a 2016 paper by three authors, David H. Otter, David Dorn and Gordon H. Hanson. That paper was on China's economic rise and its impact on the world's trade and labor markets. Remember, Communist China was once mired in poverty. In 1978, it started its economic reforms. It opened up its economy and allowed for more private enterprise. Since then, China's GDP has grown more than 80 times. This growth was driven by rapid industrialization. China became the world's factory. Its massive manufacturing sector churned out millions of products and it exported them at low cost. Chinese exports got a boost when it joined the World Trade Organization in the early 2000s. Because joining it meant China faced fewer tariffs and restrictions from its trading partners. China had abundant and cheap labor, cost of manufacturing was low there, so Chinese goods were quite cheap and they flooded the global markets. Consumers benefited from low inflation. Companies based in the United States and elsewhere shifted their manufacturing to China to profit from low cost of manufacturing. And in 2010, China became the world's largest exporter. But a heavy price was paid by industries and communities in countries that were swamped by cheap Chinese goods. Companies that were unable to withstand the intense competition often laid off staff. So livelihoods were lost and workers were displaced. See what happened in California's Silicon Valley. Here companies like Apple, HP and Cisco used to manufacture goods. But after 2001, these companies moved most of their production to China. So manufacturing jobs dropped by 50% in this county. Let's see what happened in another county in the US. Cedar Rapids in Iowa lost over 40% of its manufacturing jobs, mainly in furniture and machinery. While Silicon Valley was the worst hit by manufacturing job losses caused by the first China trade shock in the US, 3.4 million manufacturing jobs were lost across the country. A 2021 research found that the hardest hit areas in the US could not bounce back from that shock even a decade later. These manufacturing job losses were not confined to the US. Many countries bore the brunt. Rising Chinese imports resulted in higher unemployment, lower labor force participation, and reduced wages in affected countries. Now, coming back to the second China trade shock and how some parts of the world are grappling with it. China's new wave of industrialization is not limited to manufacturing the end products in the fields of electric vehicles, lithium-ion batteries, and solar cells. It is also developing global supply chains for critical raw materials such as rare earths needed in these industries. So the challenge posed by China to the world in these sectors is huge. What's more, Chinese steel exports are also threatening the survival of steel industries around the world. Indian and European steel makers are among those bearing the brunt. Latin American nations have hit back with prohibitive tariffs on Chinese steel imports. Economists like Rory Green warn that the impact of the second China trade shock could be potentially bigger than the first one. So what are the US and the rest of the world doing about China Shock 2.0? Other than imposing high tariffs, many tech companies are diversifying supply chains away from China for a range of products. The US is taking steps to boost chip manufacturing at home. It is investing millions of dollars to develop a research facility to strengthen domestic supply chains of critical minerals. The EU has enacted the European Chips Act to boost domestic chip production. India has rolled out its semiconductor mission. So what is China's response to the pushback against its cheap exports? It's been hitting back with anti-dumping investigations. Let's now see how India is dealing with the second China trade shock. India has imposed anti-subsidy measures on China as it too fears a repeat of the manufacturing job losses it saw during the first China trade shock. In 2024 alone, India imposed over 30 anti-dumping investigations against China, the most against any country. Look at the products under India's scrutiny, from plastic processing machines to industrial laser machines, among others. Indian businesses have been pushing for multiple extensions of these anti-dumping duties. They say China is not a market economy and uses predatory practices to eliminate competition, and this harms them. While India is putting a premium on domestic manufacturing, given the extent of India's imports from China, dealing with a second China trade shock is not easy for India. India's goods imports from China surged from over $10 billion in 2005-2006 to over $61 billion in 2015-16. They surpassed a record $100 billion in 2023-24. India's recent economic survey warned that in response to India's anti-dumping probe against Chinese entities, China has been quietly blocking India's access to solar equipment. This it is doing to hinder India's growth in the renewable energy sector. 80% of India's solar cells and modules still come from China because China dominates the entire solar energy manufacturing supply chain. But under Make in India, launched in 2014, things are changing slowly but surely. With more manufacturing taking place in India, hundreds of thousands of jobs are being created. In the electronics sector, mobile phone imports to India have declined by 85%. India is catering to its domestic demand and also exporting made-in-India mobile phones. Considerable investments are coming in from global technology majors such as Apple, which has increased manufacturing in India. In the electric vehicle sector too, instead of relying on China's cheap electric vehicle exports, India has ramped up domestic production of EVs. India, Vietnam and others are building alternative manufacturing hubs. The Quad and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, or IPEF, are working on diversification of supply chains in the Indo-Pacific region. So countries are mitigating the impact of China's economic policies by strengthening their own industries and through regional cooperation. Yet, the scope and scale of such interventions need to increase to meet the challenge. To sum it up, the first China trade shock is over, but 25 years later, the world is now facing a second China trade shock. It is not that China does not have other options to stimulate its economic growth besides sending more goods abroad. In fact, economists inside and outside China have long urged it to balance its economy by encouraging domestic consumption. But Xi Jinping has refused to take that advice. It's easy to see why countries have sought to limit surging Chinese exports, as they can put domestic firms out of business and cost a lot of jobs. In more economically advanced countries, this influx threatens to upend emerging technology sectors and derail post-pandemic plans of de-risking economies by shifting supply chains away from China, leaving you with some food for thought. Are we ready to counter a bigger trade shock this time? And what about the present rules of the international trade regime? Are they adequate to deal with China Shock 2.0? If not, this is a call to action. Have you heard of the term karoshi? It's a Japanese word. And what does it mean? The word karoshi means death from overwork. But you may wonder, why are we bringing this up today? The answer lies in these reports. A 26-year-old chartered accountant at the multinational consulting firm Ernst & Young died allegedly due to workload in the western Indian city of Pune. And then there is a case from Lucknow where a bank employee also died allegedly from work stress. In the U.S, a 35-year-old Bank of America investment banker passed away after working over 100 hours a week. In the Pune case, 26-year-old Anna Sebastian Pirail joined Ernst & Young as a chartered accountant. Just 4 months later, she died due to work pressure. After Anna's death, her mother wrote to the company. She said Anna was often given work at the end of her shift, making her work overtime. Anna worked late shifts and even on Sundays. It was Anna's first job. She was a school and college topper and excelled in extracurricular activities. She passed her CA exams with distinction. Despite a bright future, Anna's life was cut short. She died on 20th July. Sadly, no one from Ernst & Young attended her funeral. The Indian government has launched an investigation into Anna's death. Anna's story is the shocking reality of present work culture. According to the International Labour Organization, India ranks second globally in overworked nations, with 51% of employees working 49 hours or more per week. So how many hours is too many? The International Labour Organization suggests a healthy limit is 48 hours a week or 8 hours a day. But India is not alone. Bhutan tops the list, with 61% of its workforce exceeding 49 hours. Other South Asian countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan also rank high. In China, there is the controversial 996 work culture. It mandates employees to work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, significantly exceeding standard working hours. Now see this report. The 996 work culture in China led a 24-year-old girl to gain 20 kilograms weight in 1 year. In China, overwork obesity is frequently attributed to stress related to work pressure. This trend reveals a worrying pattern where people are consistently working long hours. A joint study by the World Health Organization and the ILO says working 55 or more hours per week is associated with an estimated 35% higher risk of a stroke and a 17% higher risk of dying from ischemic heart disease compared to working 35 to 40 hours a week. In today's fast-paced, highly competitive global market, professionals are pushing themselves to extreme limits. The pressure to perform is intense. But what's the real cost of this non-stop drive? And is it worth sacrificing our well-being for the sake of material success? The consequences of overwork go far beyond the office walls, affecting our mental and physical health. Employee burnout is a serious issue. It's more than just feeling tired or stressed. It is a psychological condition caused by chronic workplace pressure, leaving us emotionally drained and exhausted. Professionals in technology, law, medicine, journalism and media, marketing, sales, finance, and pharmaceuticals often work excessively long hours. Not just IT companies, banks, financial institutions, and insurance firms also struggle with burnout. That is because they serve offshore clients, collaborate with international teams, and juggle irregular schedules and time zones. Imagine working late hours in India only to extend your day to match colleagues abroad. So it is a 24/7 grind. In India, the Factories Act of 1948 ensures factory workers don't work more than 48 hours a week, with mandatory rest days and overtime pay if they do. But this law only applies to factory workers and does not protect professionals. So what's being done to address the overwork culture? One of the most workaholic nations in the world, Japan, is exploring a 4-day work week. The Japanese government has rolled out the Work Style Reform Initiative to help promote a better work-life balance. In Europe, Belgium has become the first country to legislate a 4-day work week. Germany launched a pilot project involving 45 companies earlier this year to test the feasibility of a 4-day work week. Recently, Australia introduced the right to disconnect law that allows employees to ignore communications after working hours. Similar laws are already in place in countries such as France, Spain, Italy, Belgium, Portugal, and Ireland. So it's time to wake up to the dangers of overwork. Will we prioritize success over well-being or find a balance? Let's work to live, not die working. That's all in this edition of Connecting the Dots. We'll see you next week with more raging issues. Until then, it's a goodbye from all of us in the Delhi newsroom. This is Munmun Bhattacharya signing off. Take care and stay safe.